Hey everyone, Casey Irvine here, and today I want to talk to you about agentic context and context management. And a phrase that I hear said a lot, and I even say, is context is king. And maybe you've even heard that phrase, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into what we mean by that. What is context? What is in your context or your agent's context? Why you should care, and then really more the what I want to get into is what I do to manage context in my workflows. So first, let's talk about what context is. But I'm going to do a demo today. It's going to be kind of a silly toy demo, but it just helps illustrate um, what context is. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a directory here, and we're going to go into that. All right, and I don't even think I need to get in it, but we'll just go ahead and start Copilot CLI. Yes, trust the files in this folder. I'm just going to switch my model, and we are going to use Sonnet. There we go, perfect. Okay, so your context is kind of what your agent or what the LLM sees in the world. It is um, what you're prompting. It is the system prompt. It is the tools. It is its agent file. It is all sorts of things. So the thing that I want you to be aware of is you're sharing it with a lot of different stuff, and all of these things add to your context. And what's useful is you can view what your context looks like pretty easily in the Copilot CLI by just doing context. And it's give you this nice graphical representation of what's taking up your context, roughly, and then how much context you have. So you can see these little dots showing kind of what's my context what context is being used. And as this starts to get more and more full, I'm going to start to be more and more concerned, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. But we can see that it gives you some indication of what's taking up context. And the system and tools is like, this is your system prompt, but the tools part is interesting. And there's probably subtleties that even I don't understand here. But one of the key things I want to tell you about is there's this known issue with MCPs where they kind of dump a bunch of context right up front into your context window. And so if I look at the MCPs that I have enabled, you would see that I have quite a bit. And in fact, I think it maybe even said if I don't want to show the ones, just in case there's work stuff in there. But I think it even said at the beginning I had 7 MCP servers. So that might be something I want to look at if I see my context window just being really used up at the start. Maybe I don't need as many MCP servers. Maybe I don't need as many agents or things that are loading kind of right up front. Custom instruction files. This is where that applyTo header that I mentioned in my last video, where we talk about instruction files, can be really helpful because the model won't load the full, or the agent won't load the full instruction file. It'll just look and see if it applies to what it's doing. Same with skills. If the agent is sort of greedily loading skills, maybe you just want to make sure you have only the skills that you need in that session or being loadable by that session. So all things to think about when you're thinking about context and watching this window, this fill up here. So why do you care? So it's also not just about how much of your context is used, but also what's in your context. But the reason we care about how much of your context is used is because as that starts to get fuller and fuller, you're sort of reaching the limits of what the model can take in information wise. It'd be like the difference between giving the model a summary of a book and ask it to recall some information about that summary versus like having it try to read a whole book all at once. And different models have different limitations there, and especially like what can happen as the context gets longer is you'll definitely start to see more hallucinations. You'll start to see kind of like, and I think what really happens more when the context window gets full is there can be conflicting or confusing information in there. So an example I like to use is, let's say you and your coworkers go into a meeting and you're supposed to decide the name of your new product. And you record the meeting because, of course, you want to have your agents be able to reason over it, or just for others to watch it later. And so you have a pretty heated discussion about what you want this thing to be named. And you come out having made a decision, and your boss asks you, "Hey, what did you guys decide about the name of our new product?" And you hand them the transcript file. So they're probably not going to read that super in depth. they're going to skim the transcript file. But in the transcript file, you guys had a back and forth discussion. Maybe you even had thought you figured it out at one point, but then someone brought up a great point that that name was already taken, and so you had to reiterate. These are all fine details that your boss might miss when he's skimming the transcript of your meeting. It'd be much better to sort of hand your boss a summary of that meeting and say, here's what we decided, why we arrived at that. They can much more easily grep and understand sort of like a couple words, a couple sentence summary than the whole transcript of maybe what would have been a 30 or 1 hour meeting. That's kind of what your agent is doing. So the more and more context you give it, it might not be hitting on the things that you want it to. It might be forgetting some of the things that were really important. Maybe you said at the beginning of your session, hey, I don't want you writing any code. And then towards the end of that session, as your context window gets filled up, it sort of forgot to look at that, or it forgot to hold that in the top of its mind, and it starts writing code. So you definitely can see some of that. And there's ways to sort of inject important things back into your context, but those become more advanced scenarios where maybe you were just having a context management problem altogether. Um, so that's about context. Sometimes we call these things context rot or context poisoning. That's again sort of more about like forgetting important details that were maybe at the beginning of your context, your beginning prompt versus later on. And then poisoning, I sort of think of as that conflicting information or just something bad. Maybe the model did something or reasoned about something. And I've seen this happen plenty of times where it'll sort of come to the wrong conclusion, but then I'll correct it, but then it still goes back to that wrong conclusion later because it's just in the context. It making that conclusion is still sort of in its transcript. It's window of things that it knows about, and so it might latch onto that instead of your correction later. Again, models are improving at this stuff all the time, especially with harnesses help, but it's still very much a thing to be aware of. So I think now I can get into at least the beginning of my demo to show you guys more of these things. um, so I'm going to do a plan for like a pretty simple tool and then show you like how I sort of manage the context through that. And what you can do to help with like if you're doing this sort of plan, execute, review workflow, how you can help your context. So this is going to be a pretty simple plan. So I'm just going to go ahead and switch into plan mode. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to show you something because Copilot CLI has something called checkpoints. And I want you to at least see what my checkpoints are before I start these things. So it says I have no checkpoints. Okay, that's important. And I just needed to show you that real quick. Okay, now let me enter the plan. So we're going to write a file summarizer tool in Python. You can call the tool file-summary.py. It's going to take a path as an argument, and it's going to output a summary of the files, total count, total size. And I want you to include a format option to be able to let me specify a CSV, JSON, or like a markdown table output. Make sure you write any unit tests and that you write a README and well document this tool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and enter that prompt. Not my best prompt ever, but again, this is supposed to be kind of a toy demo. Okay, perfect. So it is done writing the plan. And normally I would, Control E to show the full plan and kind of review this. And we might have some back and forth about, what's in the plan, adding some things to the plan. But again, for demo purposes, we're just going to move on. But in my real workflows, this is usually like a 4 or 5 turn process of iterating over the plan, maybe even making some hand edits if necessary, and then telling the model about it or the agent about it. But so for here, I'm just going to say exit plan mode. And I'm going to prompt myself because I want to show you guys some things. So we've written the plan now, and I'm going to prompt it. But first, I'm going to show you the context. So it hasn't, we haven't used a ton, but we've definitely used some, and it shows that like I'm at now kind of 25% of my context usage. And obviously more turns, more reasoning, things like that would have caused this number to go higher. I don't really need everything in that context that was my back and forth with the model at this point, with the agent at this point. I have the plan. That's what I'm going to use to execute it, and hopefully I've written a good enough plan. So there's a couple things I can do at this point. I can use something called clear. Now, clear is really just gonna abandon the session and start fresh. Now, here's why I I don't use clear a lot. A couple reasons. If you abandon this session, you're going to get a new session ID. But the plan document is stored in this session. So if I do use clear, a cool tip is you can use the bang exclamation point command to enter a shell, and then I would just copy. Where's my plan output? It's here somewhere. There we go. I would use this to copy my plan document somewhere where I want it. Maybe I have a directory where I keep my plans. Maybe I put it in the repo, but move it somewhere because it'll still be in your session data and you can always resume that session later. But like if you want to refer back to this plan for an implementation and it's a new session, you either have to remember this path or copy this path, which you can do that too. But it's not going to be like, this is not going to be your current session path. You're going to get a new session ID. So I would just recommend copy it somewhere else, or at least like make sure you save this path off somewhere so that when you refer back to it, you can. But I don't usually do that. One, a lot of reasons, because I don't want to have to remember to copy. But two, I do think there is some usefulness to having like the plan process as part of your agent's context, but maybe not all of it. So what I will usually do after planning, before I have the model execute the plan, is I will use a command called compact. And this is what it's going to do, is take my conversation history up to this point and summarize it. And so just remember that I showed you my context window was about 25% usage. So now I'm going to call compact. And it even showed me well, that's from my previous run of context usage, I think. So you just have it right there, 25%. Okay, and so compaction has completed. Let me show you the context again. So as you might expect, summarizing didn't do too much for me, but it did give me a little bit. Obviously, again, longer planning sessions, more elaborate plans. There's going to be more context used. This is going to help reduce that context. So it did reduce my context usage by a little bit. In practice, you can reduce it by quite a bit more, again, for long planning sessions and things like that. The other thing I want to point out is like you have something called a new checkpoint. And I don't do a lot with checkpoints myself, but the reason I want to bring this up is because so you can use use session to view specific checkpoints. You can look at your checkpoints because Copilot CLI will often a number 1 checkpoints 1. Yeah, so you can see what it did. So and you can see sort of the summary that it wrote as part of that. And the reason that that's important is because Copilot CLI will often, if you're getting a long running session, it will compact your session conversation history for you. And so you want to be able to know when this happens. So using this session checkpoints command to see where, is it truly just, I thought I had a way to list checkpoints. So if I can't figure that out here, file sort. Yeah, okay, yeah. So it shows you that I have the one checkpoint used. Perfect. So you might find that you actually have lots of different checkpoints, and that might mean that your session history has been summarized multiple times. That can be okay, but it can be something to be aware of if if you want to take a look and say, well, what actually is in one of these summaries, because maybe that's where some of your context poisoning is, if the wrong thing got summarized, or just to be aware that Copilot CLI has been compacting your session as it goes on longer and longer, and it'll kind of use what your context window usage is to know when it should compact. So it's a really cool feature of Copilot CLI, but it's one of those you want to know that it's happening and to be aware of it, especially in longer running sessions. Okay, so that's compact and checkpoints. So now what I would typically do is I want to execute the plan. So I've compacted my session, it's summarized. I'm going to switch into autopilot mode, and I'm going to maybe even switch my model to something a little bit cheaper, right? So let's go ahead and use Haiku 4.5. because I wanted to use the really expensive, really nice reasoning model for my planning. But now that I'm going to execute it and I have the plan, I can use a cheaper model. Something else to be aware of is the higher level of the reasoning on the model, the more tokens it's going to use, because it kind of sends its internal dialogue into the context window and sends that along with the request. So, a model like Opus, or using Opus extra high reasoning, is going to use more tokens than something like Sonnet or Haiku. So another thing to be aware of, it's going to use up more of your context, is what I mean to say, as well as tokens. But really the point of this video is it's going to use up more of your context, so something to be aware of. Granted, those models have larger context windows generally, but it is something to be aware of when you're picking your reasoning level. Okay, so I've switched my model, but I don't just have to run here. I can use something called fleet mode, and I believe fleet mode is still experimental. But you can turn experiment mode on and you can use fleet mode. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it'll use subagents. And let me kick this off, and then I'll talk about why subagents are important. Um, Execute the plan. Make sure to make use of subagents to write the README file and any test files that you can write ahead of time when executing the plan. And for demo purposes, I'm kind of extra prompting it to use the subagents because I really want to make sure it does. Naturally, this will happen. You don't really have to do this sort of special prompting most of the time, but I want to make sure the demo goes well. So let me go ahead and execute this. So the region subagents are important. So granted, this is going to parallelize some things, and it uses this internal SQL database that marks to-dos and tracks dependencies, so it can do this pretty effectively. But the reason we're talking about subagents in this video is because subagents get their own context. And there's some built-in subagents that do things like search for files, and like even I think even sometimes reading files can go through a subagent depending on what it's reading for. There's some built-in ones. You can also make your own agents be subagents if you have like a persona that, and I don't really have a great example of this, but maybe you have a persona that you kind of find yourself running on the code all the time. Well, if you use fleet mode, or you prompt your harness to use that subagent, it's going to get its own context window, and that means that it's not going to pollute your main context window, and it's going to get its own separate context. You can also consider having your agents return something more structured, like a really defined markdown output, structured JSON, things like that, so that it can take advantage of the context that it does use in your main session more effectively. And then what's really cool is I can use the tasks command to see my different subagents that are running. Another plug for Brady's squad, Brady Gaster's squad uses subagents pretty effectively. You talk to the main orchestrator and it'll sort of fan out subagents, and he even says like use the phrase fan out to just make sure they kind of do that. And it's really nice because it can use some cheaper models sometimes to execute things, because it is sort of making better use of the context by using subagents where not everything is going into your main session's context. I will point out that agent files are one of those things that do get loaded into your context. So having a really, really large agent file isn't necessarily always the best, but there are trade-offs there. So that is something that makes it into your context window. And then just for fun, we can also kind of watch our context as it's getting used up. So obviously the code implementation is using more of our context now, and we're at 29% of our context usage. We're using a cheaper model, so probably has less context than Sonnet would have, although I didn't fact check that. I'd have to go back and look. I'm not really sure if it has a smaller context window or not, but I would suspect it has a as large or smaller context window than Sonnet does. Okay, so our agent finished executing, and I went ahead and dumped the context using the /context command. You can see we're using about 33% of our tokens, up from I think 25% when we finished the plan. And we can see I opened up VS Code here. It did do some stuff. It created this, so it really did things. But let's say I don't like what it did. There's a couple options I'd have. I could, yell at my agent and say, "Hey, you didn't do it right. Do it again." But I've already used up some of my context, and maybe as it starts going to do the thing that I were trying to correct it on, it's going to refer back to the context of it doing it poorly, and it's just going to fall back to doing that again. So what I can do instead is use something called undo, which I apologize in advance because this works if you have your code in a Git repository to begin with, which I didn't do. So I tried to add it later, but it doesn't work that way. But you'll have to take my word for how this works. But basically, this will rewind your session back to your last turn. And my last turn in this case was just me prompting the agent to execute the plan. So it did all of this in one turn. So if I hit undo, it's going to take me back to that session state that was right after I compacted after the plan and told it to execute. It will revert all the files or changes that it's made up until that point. And so I can literally start back to right where I was before I prompted it and prompted it, excuse me, and tell it to do something different. Maybe I want to do it in Rust this time. Maybe I want to hand edit the plan some more. Maybe I want to go back into planning mode and make some more adjustments and then start that cycle over with. But I don't have to, one, throw this session entirely away, or keep poisoning my context by going forward and trying to like yell at my agent to correct it. So I can use this undo command, or I can hit escape twice. And then, yeah, you'll get this warning that says rewind's not available because you're not in a Git repository. If you do this in a Git repository, it will work. Take my word for it and all that good stuff. The other thing that I would say is if you have like a really long running session, so remember I was talking about checkpoints and compaction and how GitHub Copilot CLI will do that for you. Sorry, if I go into session and checkpoints, I can see that it didn't take any additional checkpoints. So it just it summarized my planning, and it only has that one checkpoint. So I can see that it didn't checkpoint along the way. For like a super long running session, you might see some additional checkpoints here, and you could go back and check and see what it actually summarized. But in this case, it didn't have to do that. Let's see, is there anything else I want to show you guys? Apologize again for the undo not being set up properly. Oh, I will say you can see that it was using subagents to do this, and you can see references to that. And one of the reasons that my context is not huge is it was using subagents to execute a lot of what it was doing. And so it does have to like read the results of the subagents of what they did. But if that subagent is just writing code, the main session may not necessarily need that. So again, really handy if you have like super complex tasks or you have like a bunch of things sort of fanning out at once. It's going to sort of save your main context that you're working in from getting over polluted or just growing too large. All right, with that, this is already, I think, a pretty long video. So thank you guys for listening, watching up until this point. And yeah, happy vibe coding.